It's another Manly Monday, and this Manly Monday, we're talking about healthy masculinity. And this came out of a discussion I had with somebody who talked about being on a subreddit. Hello, Zelda's Tale. Being on a subreddit and the discussion coming up about, if we can be anything, why do we need masculinity? Like, let's just throw it all out. It's ultimately useless. And I want to talk about why that's not true and why constructed doesn't mean important, and why we're never going to get rid of societal expectations because they do things for a culture. And so it's better to create healthy norms and expectations, right, Zelda? As opposed to trying to eliminate them. And hopefully this will be a useful video in terms of discussion. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/LeannaK. Both of those get you access to the Discord server if you just want to tip me for some bucks because, you want to help out, don't want anything in return. That's what the GoFundMe's are for now. We're renovating that soon. So social constructs and social categories. All cultures have them. And we get really hung up on this concept of traditional masculinity. And traditional masculinity has only existed, what we call that, has only existed since maybe World War I, definitely World War II. Before that, if you read any literature before the Great Wars, men were much more demonstrative. If you read The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien is hearkening back to that past time where men were more expressive and formed social bonds very differently. And I remember the first time I read The Lord of the Rings, is like actually read it as like, these guys are crying all the time. And then in university, I read The Odyssey and they were crying all the time. And we associate that sort of, Roman Empire cliche and sort of the Greek ideals. Sparta tends to dominate everything. And, the modern idea of stoicism, which is not actually the school of thought in Greece. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings about how new this idea of, traditional masculinity is, or even what it is. I mean, if you look at how do you define traditional masculinity, people tend to put a negative slant on that, right? But if you look at a character like Superman is they call him the Blue Boy Scout for a reason. He is such a symbol of traditional masculinity. It's like, what's wrong with that? What we think is traditional masculinity is actually what some places call patriarchal masculinity. I just think calling it disposable masculinity might be a good way of putting an accurate label on it, because what it was is this idea of sacrifice in the name of service for your country, for your society. And that was what was really drummed into people. The show All Creatures Great and Small, of all shows, gets into it in season 2 with the season 2 takes place in 1939, and men who were raised post World War I or who were children during World War I felt this need to serve because they, everybody was scared. Everybody had seen the devastation or heard about the devastation in World War I. Here we are. It's happening again with even more advanced weaponry. Holy shit. And these ideals of sacrificial duty, they really started in men and women at that time. The idea, and I mean, things changed very, very significantly for women during those periods because men were at the front. So women learned, hey, we can do all these things. And then the men came back, and the plan was, well, these guys are all shell-shocked, what we now know as PTSD, so we have to make things nice and normal and stable for them. And so we need to turn back the clock, go back to mom at home, dad goes to job, dad very important, head of the household. It was completely artificial. It drove up a shit ton of debt, making sure white men could have a rarefied existence with the single family home with the white picket fence on one income. And I say white men very specifically because, black men in America did not benefit from the post-World War II programs or things like the GI Bill. And so that wasn't me politicizing. That was just historical fact. And that was when things started to become more rigid, and therefore things started to fracture. And now I don't think it's any surprise, because what was going on in the 1950s as well? Television could normalize things, make things seem normal that weren't. I mean, Leave It to Beaver is an example of a show that didn't actually depict how families were. They were depicting an idealized family that very rarely existed this is, June Cleaver, ideal woman, ideal man, ideal family. Nothing really bad happens here. Precocious fun, be normal, because they were just trying to keep a lid on the combat trauma. And what they ended up with instead is an epidemic of alcoholism, suicide, and domestic abuse, because it didn't work. And so then we had the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s. Then we got into, the Wolf of Wall Street 80s, the 90s. We got the eyeliner back. The 2000s got really, really weird. And now we're sort of in this crisis because with social media, we know a lot more about strangers than we used to. People put a lot of themselves online, but it's still very curated. It's still very managed. It's still very Leave It to Beaver, in the sense that people are constructing personas online that aren't necessarily authentic. They're heavily based on optics. And the minute you sacrifice your authenticity to try to create acceptance or popularity, that hole inside you starts growing. And that's where I think the idea of healthy masculinity has gotten lost. Like I talked about on Friday, the idea of this is affecting women and girls. We have to fix the system. This is affecting men and boys. We have to fix men and boys. And I do find a lot of men I work with, my one-on-one stuff, the Leanna Cares program, is 90% men, which is, that was always a working title. I haven't found a new one I like better yet. But it is mainly men. And like I talked about the no pity zone and the fact that it's amazing how many guys are just desperately trying not to make a mistake. And it's all about limiting social interactions to limit mistakes. And so, there's men are overwhelmingly lonely. And there was a trend in the 80s after Vietnam when the whole warfare changed with Vietnam and resistance to the draft became, I mean, with mass media and with mass communications, you couldn't do the propaganda and the unified message the way they did in World War I and World War II. There were dissenting opinions. There was also an entire generation of young men whose fathers were abusive because they had combat trauma and they didn't want to go to war. They didn't want to. What were they fighting for? The 80s recession was the first generation of university educated men who were getting laid off. It was a big fracture in the optics of what that masculine norm was. And that's why, as that's gotten worse and worse and worse and worse, as there's more and more and more opinions, and now we've got this throwback to the whole trad thing. And the interesting thing about the right-wing pundits who claim to really be into this, traditional masculinity, none of those guys perform it terribly well. And they seem to associate traditional masculinity not with being, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, is this man bothering you, ma'am, like Superman. They seem to associate traditional masculinity with this disapproving father figure that made you tough and very sad inside. But you're not allowed to feel sad, so you don't think about it, so you just stuff it in the man box and don't look. And that's not what traditional masculinity is. So what's the purpose? What's the purpose of masculinity? How can it be healthy? Well, when we're right at the ages of 4 and 6, our gender identity starts to form. Despite what certain right-wing politicians insist, most of us know whether we are innately a boy or innately a girl by the time we're about 6 years old, and we spend the rest of our young lives trying to figure out either how to fit into the archetypes that we see as ideal or how to deal with not measuring up to that. And that point of comparison can be very useful because in the case of masculinity, say you have a shitbag father or say dad's not around. The social construct of masculinity, those role models are something to compare yourself to that tells you if you're kind of going in what society deems the right direction or the wrong direction. And so the construct of masculinity is not the problem. It's what's held up as right and good. When it's not right and good, that's the problem. And that's why, boys that it's interesting because a lot of people take the wrong messages from characters like Superman, characters like Batman. It's gotten to the point where I can't even talk about comics with a lot of people because we're not even having the same experience. And to me, Superman was always the good guy, like not perfect, but he worked very hard at being the everyman to check his own power, as opposed to Batman, who has a ton of daddy issues and works them out with his fists on, when you think about it, all those goons that work for the Joker, the Penguin, and all that stuff, they're probably just other schlubs that didn't have a bunch of opportunities, and this was the way to have a place in the world and earn all right money because Gotham seems like a hellhole. And that's why I've become less and less enamored of Batman over time. I do have my Batman Beyond back there. But, if we look at Superman as traditional masculinity, healthy traditional masculinity, that stacks up okay, but I'm not super strong. And that's where people get lost. Like, he has super strength. It's like, he's super strong. He's not invulnerable. There's kryptonite. To me, what I see there is you can be the physically strongest guy in the room. You still got a weakness. So humble. And humility does not mean feeling worthless. Humility is the opposite. Humility is feeling secure enough in yourself that you don't have to know it all. You don't have to control everything. You don't have to be the smartest guy in the room. That, to me, is healthy masculinity. That's Superman to me. Not, oh, you're strong and you can punch stuff. But for some odd reason, people connect to the physical strength element. And I honestly think that that's a fear response. If I am super strong, people can't hurt me anymore. And let's face it, in the era of guns being all over the place in America and spreading here in Canada, in the era of, the psychological torture known as social media, muscles don't defend you against either of that. The emotional resiliency that Superman models, despite kryptonite being a thing, that's a healthy model of masculinity that still is very much about that fortitude, very much about honor and dignity and realistic optimism. And the Rocky thing of, it's not how hard you hit, it's how hard you can get hit and keep getting back up. That's how you win. And that's what's gotten lost in the attack on the idea of masculinity in general and traditional masculinity. The fact that society went full grimdark beefcake cinema in the 80s post-Vietnam with things like, Terminator, Rambo. I mean, kids weren't watching Rambo, and the Terminator was the bad guy in those movies, not the good guy. I mean, the Terminator movies, it's a woman lead. The woman is the good guy. The woman is the one leading the resistance. I don't know how it became the Stallone Schwarzenegger era. Rocky, I get. You guys know Rocky is some of my favorite movies, and they are like the Book of Job in that he is put through so much. And the thing that makes Rocky such a compelling character, and I compare him to Kiryu from Yakuza, the games, Like a Dragon games, because they've got that same simpleness, almost a childlike quality in, they're not super smart, but they do have this almost savant-like wisdom of, because they don't overcomplicate things, finding that nobility, finding being a good person. Well, they don't question those traditional masculine virtues of keeping your word and being there for your friends and fighting the good fights. That idea of being someone whose word matters is something that, the political factions associated with going back to the good old days, they've kind of let that one slip. And the thing I find strange about that is I'm old enough to remember that if you got up in someone's face, they could punch you in yours. And that might be the reason that we believed in freedom of speech back then, but we didn't get to hide behind zero tolerance policies. There was still the idea that if someone hit you, sometimes you deserved it. And I mean, that wasn't necessarily great. because then men got hit and were given the idea that, well, men and women are equal. So, even before we had that idea that men and women were equal, men still beat their wives because all the angry, all the shame, all the I can't hit my boss, I can't hit this guy, I can't hit a whole bunch of things that are making me feel terrible while she's there, And that is really what it comes down to. And when you think about that, it's kind of pathetic. And with women having a lot of the same job pressures now as men, and a lot of the same things making women feel like shit, we're seeing a lot more women abuse men. Now, that may always have been a thing, but the really intense stuff, we're starting to lift the rock and see what's underneath. And it makes sense, right? Same pressures, same motivators, same, well, you deserve this beating. Well, if it's fair to do to me, then it's fair to do to someone else, right? We have to stop that sense of disposability. And that's why when we talk about, disposable male syndrome, I think that, the men's rights activists get it wrong in that it's not really about the draft anymore, because there hasn't been a draft since Vietnam in the US. It's about that sense that starts much, much younger, that boys aren't allowed to have feelings because it's not tough. And unfortunately, instead of working against that, we've demonized the way men do express certain emotions differently than women. We keep telling men, it's okay to cry. It's okay to cry. Well, some men don't cry as much. I said to one guy last week, I said, it's a why is my face raining moment, right? It just, there is a certain biological element of whether or not someone's a crier. That doesn't mean they don't feel sad. That doesn't mean they can't have a way to express sadness. It's perfectly fine for anybody to cry, because there was a time that the slogan was, Bill can cry, but Hillary can't, because women were trying to be seen as leaders, whereas men in, the time Bill Clinton was president, that idea of being kind of cool, but sensitive as well. I feel your pain, that was in. And so women were starting to go, women were starting to be told your emotions are not valid. And, women can behave just as badly as men when that's pushed on them, because there was a whole set of emotions women weren't supposed to feel. Things like anger, things like, jealousy, things like, any of those more aggressive emotions. The idea that you want anything was considered unfeminine because it was considered masculine, and femininity is kind of this opposition to masculinity thing, and it's difficult because we don't talk about it holistically. We look at masculinity, we look at femininity. We don't look at how the two social constructs, the two social categories interplay with each other. Because there is, it's one of those things where the world tells men, and, as a woman leader, listen to me on this one, please be open to it. They tell men, you just have to learn to accept instructions or orders from a woman. And then they go and tell women, look, you have to make them think it's their idea because they're just not going to listen to you. They're going to get reactive if you tell them to do something. And so the same powers that be are putting men and women in a war with each other and making both sides embittered. And so what we see on the internet, in the discourse around Taylor Swift is not surprising. The fact that part of her appeal is that she's kind of a disaster and a terrible person. It's young women and not so young women looking for permission to feel those uglier, unfeminine things. And this took me a while to get because femininity never really took with me. I can fake it short term, but I don't do the giggles and the, oh, you're so smart and all that. I suck at pandering to egos. And I know I would be further ahead if I could do that. And that's what I mean about at some point you try to match these ideals that society has and you realize I can do this, I can't do that. And then you find your own style. You find your own way. And you recognize that despite what adults said when you were younger, that you can be anything you want if you just work hard isn't true. There are certain things you're just never going to be because not in the cards, If, you're not really tall, you're not going to be a forward in the NBA, right? So this idea of finding your place can't happen without that intermediary step of not just masculinity and femininity, but all the sort of subculture stuff like goth, nerd, steampunk, prepper, but preppy back in the prepper, something different, preppy back in the day. All these kind of identity categories where we're like, this fits me best, but it never fits perfectly, right? There's certain boxes you just don't check. And as you work through life, it's a game of becoming more and more and more comfortable with the stuff that, well, yes, I line up very well here, so this works for me. This other thing here, not so much. I mean, people pushed me to be that extroverted salesperson and rah, rah, rah and all that stuff, and it almost broke me. I had to accept that I cannot do that. I am miserable at it. I am bad at it. I am not good at selling. I am good at creating. I am good at mentoring. I am good at that stuff. But selling, I need to find someone more extroverted to do that stuff. I can design the marketing plan, but actually going out and selling, nope, not me. And it's super dumb to keep throwing myself against that wall. Never gonna be girly girl. That's why I'm tomboy with girly girl on Two Women Talking. And the whole point of that series is to show, like, look, there is more than one feminine archetype that the world does understand and know where to put you. And when you understand these constructs, when you have an archetype of masculinity that you do see as an ideal, and you do see Superman as a good guy, and wouldn't it be great to be him? Well, then you can start going, well, I'm not super strong, but that's not all there is to Superman. The fact that he's polite, and the fact that he's respectful, and the fact that, in many versions of the comic, his wife is more the career person than he is. All that stuff. I can do that, right? You don't have to check every box. And if we stop getting so hung up on this physical strength nonsense, there's a lot to masculinity and that sense of healthy competition, that sense of, There's a positive aggression. Honestly, my aggression is adorable. You know what I mean? Like, I'm someone who's like, no, and I always have been. You know, I was always Wolverine, first in the fight, first knocked out. You can make that work for you. That's not an inherently bad thing. Healthy controlled aggression is a positive. It's all about looking at these attributes, trying them on, seeing how they fit in a society that doesn't demonize experimentation, and seeing what works, what doesn't, and using it as a midway point to true individuality. And so this idea of let's just get rid of masculinity and get rid of femininity, well, we can't, because then we're taking away all those rungs in the middle of the ladder and expecting people to just jump from your parents' kid to fully individuated adults. And it just don't work that way. You need the intermediary steps. And also you need the archetype for people to subvert the archetype as well. And that interplay is very important to culture, to art, to sense of self, to self-esteem. The thing we rob both men and women of differently, and non-binary people, of course, is that self-compassion, that understanding and self-talk that says it's okay when you don't measure up on one point because, you know, you're doing real great on all these others. We focus so much on where we don't fit. We focus so much on where we fall short that we don't give any value to the things we are really good at, because if it comes easy to us, well, it's worthless. That's not true. That's absolutely not true. And because we've got everybody, because of course women are all on defense too, because we've internalized it's literally impossible to be a woman. Yeah, everybody's on defense. Everybody's playing not to lose. So nobody's winning. I worked with one guy last week and talked about how every so often in a football game, soccer for Americans, you got to go on the attack. You know, he goes back foot football. It's like, right. He goes front foot football is my favorite kind of football. It's like, yeah, sometimes in life you got to get off the back foot and get on the front foot. And if you're constantly avoiding mistakes, if you're constantly playing not to lose, what's the best outcome you can get in any match? And he says, a draw. I said, yeah, you can't spend your whole life playing to a draw. You have to win sometimes. And that was a super bro moment, you know, but it worked. It worked. It made sense. One brain connecting to another brain. That's how it works, right? That's the purpose of masculinity. That's the places where masculinity can be useful and helpful. And when it comes to talking, sometimes try sitting next to someone instead of making them make eye contact. That's something apparently men are more comfortable with. You know, if somebody has a moment, don't press them to do more. Let them step away from it and joke around and talk about bullshit for a while. That might help make them feel more secure, opening up, knowing that it stops when they want it to stop. Little things like this, if we understood more about typically male stuff, it's better for everybody, right? The communication just gets better. And we do that by not saying it's better or worse than the way women do things. It just is. And we have to make space for as many people as possible. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who uses it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/Leanna K. If you like this video and want to directly support our men's network and don't need a Discord invite, you can kick me some bucks on the GoFundMe. Thanks for watching. I always forget about this. Manly Mondays.